Welcome to our review on Adaptations to Environments 2. So what we've already looked at in our previous little review was obviously how animals are adapted to their different environments. But we need to bear in mind it's not just animals that are adapted to live in different environments. Plants also become adapted to survive. So what I've given you here are 3 different environments that we can encounter on Earth. We've got the northern pine forests, temperate forests and deserts. So if we're talking about a northern pine forest first of all, then what we find is that water is quite scarce and it's cold. So what we'll find is that through a lot of the year, the water in fact is in ice form, it's frozen, which means that our plants can't get hold of it. So what we find here in terms of our plants and their adaptations is their leaves have been reduced to needles, and that's all to do with reducing their surface area to reduce water loss. If there's not much water available to the plant, clearly it needs to keep as much inside as it can. They also have a thick wax on the surface of the leaf to reduce their water loss, and the pine needles have very few stomata, and that's again to do with reducing water loss. If we think about the temperate forests next, then this is kind of like the UK really. We get quite nice summers that are sunny and moist, and the winters are cold and dark. Now obviously the plants that live there have to adapt to those pretty different conditions. So what we find is as soon as we get to autumn, then the leaves fall from the trees. There's no point in keeping those leaves on the trees through winter because they're not going to get enough light in order to carry out photosynthesis at a fast enough rate to make it worthwhile keeping them. The leaves also have a large surface area so that when it's sunny and they're on the trees, then they can trap as much light as possible to carry out photosynthesis, and they've got a thinner wax. Because there's more moisture available to them, then they don't need to worry about maintaining as much water inside as they do in the northern pine forests. Third and final condition we can look at then is what we find in the desert. So deserts are very dry, they're hot, there's very little water available, but plants do still live there. It's not just this sandy landscape with nothing living. What we find though is that in these plants the leaves are spines which are used to reduce the surface area to reduce that water loss. They've got quite a rounded shape on them. Again, that is all to do with reducing the surface area to volume ratio. They've got spines just to avoid anything coming to eat them and feed off them. They have a very shallow root system so that when it rains they can absorb as much moisture as possible. They can have these very swollen stems to store more water, and some of them are actually quite wrinkled. If you've got a cactus, it's got some wrinkles in it when it's not watered because that allows it to swell up to store more water. Their stems are usually green to carry out photosynthesis, and they've got this very thick wax cuticle to stop water loss. What we find though is that there are certain things that occur in the environment that cause these things called environmental stresses. So what we actually find is that if the temperature changes or if the water availability changes, these are environmental stresses that our organisms that live in those environments have to be able to cope with in order to survive. If we consider this phrase surface area to volume ratio, this is very important to our animals and to our plants when they're dealing with these stressful environments. So if we think about animals that live in hot environments first of all, they've got a large surface area to volume ratio to increase the heat loss. The animals in the cold environments, however, have a small surface area to volume ratio to reduce their heat loss. So what we're looking at here is the surface area to volume ratio is always to do with losing something. If we think about our plants, then in areas where water is scarce, then they've got a reduced surface area to volume ratio to reduce the water loss. So if you remember that when there's a small surface area to volume ratio, it reduces losses, whether it be heat or water, and then if it's got a large surface area to volume ratio, it's a faster loss, whether it be heat or water, then you should be able to apply that principle to whatever situation they're asking you about in a question. The other way that animals can actually cope with these stressful environments is by altering their behaviour. So one thing that animals can do is to migrate, so that when the winter comes, if they're not very good at dealing with that cold weather, they can just fly south for the winter. They can also go into a hibernation state, so that means they're going to slow down all their life processes and enter that dormant state until those conditions improve and more food is available, for example. If we think about cold-blooded animals, then we get this idea of sunbasking. So that in that early morning sun, they come out and they lie on those nice hot rocks in order to warm them through, and that lets them become nice and active. And finally, we've got some animals that are capable of storing large amounts of water when they find it, because it's not a common occurrence. So when they do find it, they can drink large amounts and then store that in their body to tide them over.